With a 7-day ceasefire in Gaza over, fighting has resumed between Israel and Hamas. Caught in the middle are civilians from both sides. It's raised questions about proportionality and accountability. So is Israel meeting its obligations under the laws of war? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. After mediators failed to extend a 7-day ceasefire in Gaza, Israel has resumed its bombardment of the Strip. Airstrikes have targeted houses and refugee camps in the north, centre and the south of Gaza. Palestinians are already suffering a humanitarian crisis. The UN says 80% of the population has been forcibly displaced and the healthcare system has collapsed. The Israeli army's offensive raises questions of responsibility and accountability. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is acting in self-defence after the attack by Hamas on October the 7th killed 1,200 people. Under international law, Israel is the occupying power in Gaza and the West Bank and is obliged to protect all the people there. But Israel doesn't recognise Palestine as a state and says Hamas has bases in hospitals and residential areas, making them legitimate military targets. We'll be unpacking the complexities of this argument with our guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Fintan Monaghan.
Israel released Mohammed Nazal as part of a prisoner exchange agreed with Hamas. The young man spoke of mistreatment at the hands of Israeli authorities.
One of the guys was so badly beaten, his cellmates kept calling and yelling for someone to help. When they finally arrived, they felt his pulse through the bars. He was dead. After that, they would just insult us. When the soldier came to fetch me before my release, he said they would hunt me down and bring me back to jail.
Some Israeli captives released by Hamas also spoke of the harsh conditions of their detention in Gaza. Several treaties governing the treatment of civilians, soldiers and prisoners of war are known collectively as the law of armed conflict. It applies to government forces and non-state armed groups such as Hamas. Israel's treatment of Palestinian prisoners, its policies towards Palestinians in the occupied territories, and most recently its military campaign in Gaza, are raising questions about whether Israel is respecting international humanitarian law. The treaties state that combatants avoid civilian infrastructure and concentrate only on military targets. But Israel has repeatedly bombed hospitals, homes and schools in Gaza, saying Hamas uses them for military purposes.
It is a legitimate military target, and why is that? Because Hamas locates all of their offices, headquarters, their research and development, and all of their other military assets, if it's above ground, they locate themselves in civilian buildings.
Then there's the civilian death toll. Hamas was widely condemned for its military offensive in southern Israel on October the 7th. The Israeli government said 1,200 people were killed and more than 200 were taken captive. But since then, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza has killed more than 15,000 Palestinians, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Critics say Israel's response is not proportionate, another principle in the laws governing armed conflict. Israel maintains its attacks in Gaza are self-defense, but even its biggest ally, the US, has called for more protection of civilians.
But Israel has one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world. It is capable of neutralizing the threat posed by Hamas while minimizing harm to innocent men, women, and children. And it has an obligation to do so.
The legal situation is further complicated by the status of Palestine, which Israel does not consider an independent state. As the war drags on and the death toll rises, Israel is facing growing accusations that it's falling short of its obligations under international law. Fintan Monaghan for Inside Story.
Well, to discuss this further, let's bring in our guests. In Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank, Mustafa Barghouti, Secretary-General of the Palestinian National Initiative and a former information minister for the Palestinian Authority. In New York, Ahmed Abofoul, legal researcher and advocacy officer at Al-Haq, an independent Palestinian human rights organisation. And in Liverpool, in the UK, Triestino Mariniello, a professor of law at Liverpool John Moores University and a member of the legal team representing Gaza victims in the International Criminal Court. A very warm welcome to all of you. Triestino, this Friday, Israel resumed airstrikes on Gaza, once again killing civilians in huge numbers. It's now also targeting what were supposed to be safe areas in the south. Can you outline for us what are supposed to be the rules of war in this conflict?
Well, first of all, many thanks for having me today. I mean, discussing the rule of law, looking at the situation in Gaza from an international law perspective means, first of all, to discuss the context in which these hostilities are taking place. Hostilities and context cannot be assessed separately. And the context is the one in which there has been now almost 17-year blockade of the Gaza Strip, a blockade which has produced a number of crises and which has caused a situation that, according to the United Nations different bodies of the UN, was even before the 7th of October unacceptable, unsustainable and deplorable. A situation that was defined by the Secretary General of the United Nations as a collective punishment, a segregation of the civilian population in Gaza. Blockade means, under international law, occupation of the Gaza Strip, the entire Palestinian territory under international law, so not only the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, but also the Gaza Strip is still occupied, despite the 2005 disengagement of the Israeli troops. Gaza is still occupied under international law for a very simple reason, because Israeli authority still exercise an effective control of the entire Gaza Strip, controlling almost its land borders, territorial waters, airspace, even tax revenues are under the effective control of the Israeli authorities. So we are talking of a context which is still occupied under international law.
OK, so we've got to the occupying power. Mustafa Barghouti, what are the obligations of the occupying power in Gaza at the moment, but also in the West Bank?
The obligation of the occupying power is to take care of the civilians who are under their occupation. And Israel is doing exactly the opposite, not only in Gaza Strip, but also in West Bank. The whole Oslo agreement was used by Israel in the West Bank, for instance, to get rid of any responsibility towards the people who are under their occupation and transfer it to the Palestinian Authority, which continued to be an authority without authority and an authority under occupation, deprived from any real power. So the game that Israel plays all the time, and now wants to repeat it in Gaza, is to reoccupy Gaza completely, control it totally with military power, but find somebody else to take care of the humanitarian needs of the people. But not only that, they've destroyed 60% of all homes in Gaza. They've destroyed all the infrastructure in Gaza City. So practically, not only they are not taking care of the needs of the people under their occupation, they're actually destroying any possibility for life of the people under their occupation, because their actual goal is really the ethnic cleansing of Gaza completely. And that is the reason why they decided to renew their attacks now in Gaza. There isn't any part of international law, in my opinion, that Israel did not violate.
Okay.
Israel itself was established as a settler colonial project through a huge operation of ethnic cleansing against 70% of the Palestinian people who were forced out of their land, out of their country, to become refugees.
Ahmed, do you see the Palestinians' situation, the violent resistance against occupation that we are seeing, that we have seen? Is there a legality within that?
Well, using resistance in any form, including armed struggle, to resist occupation is permitted under international law. There is no questions there. The Palestinians have the right to resist the occupation. Now, which means of resistance they choose, it's up to the Palestinian people. This includes armed resistance, but it has to be in accordance and in compliance with international law, in particular, the law governing the conduct of hostilities, that is international humanitarian law.
And
so yes, absolutely.
The attack then, if we look at the attack by Hamas on October the 7th, it's been called a war crime. 1,200 people were killed, about 240 people were taken captive, both breaking international law. But as a non-state actor in this conflict, what rules of war is Hamas bound by?
The same that Israel is bound by. The application of international humanitarian law applies to all parties to the conduct of hostilities. So, but one needs to differentiate. Nobody can claim that an attack in its totality is illegal, because we just said unoccupied people have the right to resist the occupation. So this goes back to the rhetorical question: do you condemn Hamas, for example? And this is a way to derail the discussion. One cannot ask a Palestinian to condemn Hamas's attack in its totality, but when talks about Israeli use of force, talk about technicality of IHL, whether a certain strike was proportionate or not. So the attack in and by itself, so for example, attacking Israeli soldiers, dragging them out of tanks, as we saw, and taking them to Gaza, this, in particular, this exact incident is permitted under international law. Any attack against the occupying army is permitted under international law as long as it complies with the rules of international humanitarian law. On the other hand, any attack on civilians is prohibited under international law and could amount to a war crime. And the body to decide that has to be an independent investigative body, and the experience of the situation in Palestine, this body cannot be any investigative body from Israel. Israel has a history of denying justice, of systematic impunity, a history of pathologically lying about the responsibility of its soldiers and ensuring that they enjoy absolute impunity. And I think this is because the whole Israeli settler colonial project and apartheid regime is premised on a promise of impunity to its soldiers. So
we'll definitely get onto the issue of accountability a little later in the discussion. Triestino, I don't think we've really got to the crux yet of what the actual rules in a conflict are, because all conflicts are governed by the rules of law, international humanitarian law, Geneva Conventions. Can you outline for us, for our viewers, what exactly they are?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's arguable that if this is a occupied territory, also the Gaza Strip, as we said before, that Israel has a right to self-defense against an occupied territory, as many states claim. But assuming, I mean, that once the conflict has started, the military operation has started, Israeli authorities have to comply, first of all, with fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. First of all, principle of distinction, so making a clear distinction between military objectives and civilian object and civilians. Principle of proportionality, so not putting in place disproportionate attacks, and finally principle of precaution, providing civilian population with effective warnings, for instance. All of have been violated, and there is clear evidence in relation to this Gaza war. It's not a novelty. All the military operations against Gaza have been characterized by violation by the Israeli authority of these three principles, in particular of the principle of distinction, by putting in place indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects. We could provide plenty of examples since 7 October in this regard. For instance, the Shifa hospital or the other medical units in Gaza, which have a protected status under international humanitarian law, have been intentionally attacked by the Israeli authority. Or the attack of the 31st of October against Jabalia refugee camp, in which the Israeli authorities have claimed that there was a Hamas military commander. Well, there was no evidence for that. But even if Israel should provide clear evidence of that does not make the civilian group in the Jabalia refugee camp as a military target, according to international humanitarian law, as also clearly established by international criminal tribunals.
Mustafa Barghouti, what do you make of the evidence that Israel has provided so far?
What evidence? Sorry.
the evidence that it has put on social media. We're seeing videos of tunnels. We're seeing them going through areas that it said was where the hostages were being held. What do you make of those?
First of all, let's say that Netanyahu is nothing but a pathological liar besides being a war criminal. And his army and his spokespeople are repeating lies after lies, even after these lies were revoked, even by the American media. You remember the whole story about decapitation of children. CNN had to apologize for reporting that. The rape of women, Los Angeles Times had to apologize for reporting that. The number of Palestinians killed, and now we have the names and the dates of birth and everything, and the ID numbers of all people killed. So Israel continues to tell lies after lies after lies to justify
what I'm quite interested to know within the bounds of this discussion, though, is whether this kind of evidence would ever hold up in the court of law.
Absolutely not. Of course not. What will hold in the court of law, if there is an independent, real commission of international law that is not biased to Israel and that is not subjected or vulnerable to American pressure, Israel will be judged for the following war crimes: the continuous occupation, the system of apartheid, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, the genocide that is conducted against people in Gaza, and the collective punishment against the whole population, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. In addition to rejecting and refusing to implement no less than 1,000 resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council. All of that was done by Israel. Why? Because the Western governments, and especially the United States of America, and in particular the government of Britain, have allowed Israel to be impunitive to international law, have allowed Israel to be unaccountable, have treated Israel differently from every other country in the world. And look at the comparison, a very clear comparison between the way the world treats the situation in Ukraine and that in Palestine. In Ukraine, they support what they say the occupied people. In Palestine, they are supporting the occupier. And I mean by that the United States and Britain and some other Western governments.
Okay, Ahmed, I just want to jump in there because we will be looking at the international community's response just a little later. I'm still just trying to pin down what exactly it is within the law that Israel is breaking. And Ahmed, because Israel, we have to note that Israel continuously insists that its conduct is in accordance with international law. And it does seem so far to have the backing of the US in that. However, it's also cited as having a loose interpretation of the international law. So how much room is there, as a lawyer, how much room is there for interpretation of this international law?
Yeah, but to be honest, to say Israel has a loose interpretation is even an understatement. Israel has a distorted interpretation of international law. It makes a mockery of international humanitarian law, and its violations of the laws of war and of international humanitarian law are abundantly clear. I'll list for those who don't want to see it or who want to follow Israel's lies and propaganda. Israel claims, first and foremost, that it's acting in self-defense. It's important also to explain that a bit. The body of law that governs the right to self-defense for states is regulated under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. This is a right to states when they're attacked by another state, not by non-state actors like resistance groups. And even if there is a doubt about a state's right to respond to attacks coming from armed groups, definitely there is no doubt that an occupying power does not have the right to defend itself against the people it occupies, because naturally it has positioned itself as the aggressor, as the occupier. And as a matter of fact, the highest court in the United Nations, the principal judicial organ of the UN, namely the International Court of Justice, and the 2004 advisory opinion, has already said, because Israel argued self-defense back then, and the court said clearly that the right to self-defense is irrelevant when it comes to the occupied Palestinian territory. So this has to be clarified at the outset. in terms of Israel's violation, it's important to differentiate between different kinds of violations. Israel is committing war crimes during the conduct of hostilities, and this is a question of IHL principles like proportionality, distinction, and other important principles. But Israel is also committing continuous war crimes when it comes to Palestine. And I think one of the most important crimes of those is the transfer of population to the occupied territories, also known as settlements. This is one of the most important crimes because it underlines the settler colonial nature of Israel's occupation and its settler colonial ideology, Zionism, that is premised on the erasure of the Palestinian people and replacing them in their indigenous land. And that is the fundamental issue. And this is a crime that is particular.
I can jump in there because I want Triestino to look at that a little bit more. All these violations, they're held in a huge file that the ICC has. Former prosecutor Fatou Bensouda began an investigation in 2021. We've never seen anything come of that. Why not?
Well, first of all, I would like to add to the violations we've been talking. I mean, that there is already evidence for the International Criminal Court to start an investigation in relation to war crimes we have mentioned, but also to crimes against humanity or forcible transfer, looking at the evacuation order of the entire population from the north of Gaza to the south. And there is also, according to several experts and international organizations, of the ongoing commission of genocide in Gaza. As you correctly said, the former prosecutor opened an investigation in 2021 into the Gaza situation. It was a decision with a very narrow scope of the investigation, looking at 2014 war crimes committed in Gaza, at crimes committed within the context of the Great March of Return, and at the settlements in the West Bank as a war crime. Unfortunately, since the new prosecutor has taken office, the British barrister Karim Khan, he has been very reluctant in putting in place any effective investigation in this situation. The answer to your question maybe is that the court is under incredible pressure not to put in place effective investigation when it comes to nationals from powerful countries. That applied to Iraq for the British troops, that applied to Afghanistan for the US nationals, and is still applying to Palestine. This is a clear case of double standards, as has been mentioned before. The court has shown to be able to react promptly to commission of international crimes in other contexts. In few days, there was a request for arrest warrant against Russian nationals, in particular against the President Putin. We haven't seen this. It's since 2009 that Palestine has tried to engage with the ICC, but after 14 years, there has never been a simple request of arrest warrant or summons to appeal. In other words, there has never been a case before the International Criminal Court. And even in these days, the prosecutor is still very vague when it comes, when he talks about ongoing crimes committed against Palestinian victims.
Okay.
And this is...
Mustafa, I just want to bring you in at this point because we circle back now to your earlier point that you were making about international pressure or lack of it. ICC prosecutor Karim Khan is visiting Israel at the request of the victims of the October 7th Hamas attack. He's also going to be visiting Ramallah. What would be your message to him?
He should go to Gaza, not to Ramallah. He should do. He is welcomed in Ramallah, but he should go also to Gaza. That's where most of the war crimes are happening. And let me say to you that we are totally unsatisfied with the behavior of Mr. Karim Khan. There has been already so many evidence about the Israeli war crimes in 2014, 2012, 2008 in Gaza, and he never looked at it. He never started the investigation. In my opinion, he's very vulnerable to American and Israeli pressures. And I don't expect much of him when he's coming to visit Israel, who did not allow Bensouda before to visit Israel. That is not a very good indication when he is not saying that he should be also visiting Gaza. And let me say here that is exactly the problem. The problem is that Israel is allowed to be outside the ranks of international law. And one of the issues that should be raised here is the fact that Israel has declared war on occupied people. Not once, not twice, but several times. War on occupied people is illegal, is unacceptable by international law. They are occupying us and at the same time declaring war on us. And that by itself, of course, is a very grave violation. But in my opinion, the United States of America, Britain, and some other Western governments are equally responsible. Not only in terms
we were
of
just drawing to the end of our discussion,
facts.
so I just want to bring back Ahmed, because without the application of international law to Israel and Palestine, some are warning that this conflict will only continue. Do you agree with that?
100%. This is the fact that we have this situation is the systematic impunity that Israel has been enjoying and ensuring for its soldiers. I think this current situation is a very important one, not only for Palestine, but for the whole body of international law and the International Criminal Court in particular. I think this is the litmus test for its credibility. I totally agree with what the other guests have said, that it's utterly unacceptable the way that the court is approaching this situation. You need not to forget that since Karim Khan took office and became the prosecutor, he hasn't issued one statement before the 7th of October, despite Israel's continuing violations, despite Israel's attacking worshippers inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, the holiest place for Muslims around the world, an act that could have provoked a regional war. And he didn't think it's enough to issue a statement.
Ahmed, I'm just going to jump in there to give the last word to Triestino, because we've only got a minute left. I want to know from Triestino, who's going to be at the ICC, do you think Israel is going to be held to account?
Well, this is, I mean, so far we know that this has been very difficult, and it's apparently from statements of the prosecutor. I mean, this is, it's not easy that this is going, it's likely that this is going to happen, but that's the reason why the pressure on the office of the prosecutor and on the court must be kept high, not only by states which have submitted some referrals to the court in this regard, but also to civil society organizations. I would like to conclude to say that without the work of Palestinian civil society organization in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, there will be no investigation in the ICC at all. It's just thanks to them that the court has been able to open an investigation.
Okay, and many thanks to you for talking about this subject today. Mustafa Barghouti, Ahmed Abofoul and Triestino Mariniello. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.